Thanks so much, Dean's Eyes. So now to introduce our speakers. So Dr. Sharon Moore from the University of Louisville, Kent School of Social Work. Dr. Moore is a full professor of social work at the Raymond A. Kent School of Social Work at the University of Louisville. She has authored journal articles and textbooks on issues related to police shootings of Black males, the plight of African American adolescents, and the role of the African American church in community empowerment. Her published works include African American megachurches and the community empowerment, fostering life in dry places. Hands Up, Don't Shoot, Police Shooting of Young Black Males, Implications for Social Work and Human Services, and The Black Church, Responding to the Drug-Related Mass Incarceration of Young Black Males. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. She has also co-authored the text, Dilemmas of Black Faculty at U.S. Predominantly White Institutions, Issues in the Post-Multicultural Era by Mellon Press, Social Work Practice with Culturally Diverse People by Sage, and Police and the Unarmed Black Male Crisis, Advancing Effective Prevention Strategies by Taylor and Francis. She was awarded the 8th Annual Florence W. Vigilante Award for Scholarly Excellence for the article she co-authored in the Journal of Teaching and Social Work, The Dehumanization of Black Males by Police, Teaching Social Justice, Black Life Really Does Matter. Of all her accomplishments, being the primary caregiver for her father during the last 3 years of his life was her biggest honor. Derrick Jackson, who is the Director of Community Engagement for the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office in Michigan. Derrick is the social worker who became a police officer that now helps to run a police agency. As the Director of Community Engagement, Mr. Jackson has spent the last 13 years designing and implementing systems that integrate social work and criminal justice theory in order to revolutionize traditional policing strategies. Derrick is a proud graduate of Eastern Michigan University, where he studied social work as an undergraduate student, and the University of Michigan's School of Social Work for his graduate studies. As a social worker and certified law enforcement officer, he has a unique perspective and role in building bridges between law enforcement and the communities they serve. He has spent time within law enforcement learning, understanding, deconstructing, redesigning, and implementing systems within the Washtenaw County community that have helped reimagine the role of police within the community and the role of social workers within law enforcement. Where some may see social work and law enforcement on opposite ends of the spectrum, Director Jackson redefines the spectrum and uses social work and law enforcement to enhance the impact of both. And Doug Smith, Senior Criminal Justice Policy Analyst with the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition. Doug Smith is a Senior Policy Analyst with the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, working to end mass incarceration and expand opportunity for people upon release from jail and prison. He is the founding member of the statewide Leadership Council, whose membership includes leaders from across the state who have been impacted by the criminal legal system. Doug is an assistant adjunct professor of social welfare policy at the University of Texas at Austin, Steve Hicks School of Social Work, and he trains advocates nationally on effective legislative strategy. He serves on the board of the Austin Sobering Center. He graduated magna cum laude from St. Edward's University in 1994 and earned his MSSW from the University of Texas at Austin in 2000. We are honored to have you all panelists here with us today. And Dr. Moore is going to get us started. And Dr. Moore, I'm pulling up your PowerPoint now. Give me just a second, so sorry.
Kasi, can you put it on not full screen?
How does that, Dr. Moore?
Can you put it on not full screen?
Yes.
Okay.
How's that?
Let's see. I'm trying to get to some notes. All right. Okay. All right. So it's my pleasure to be here. Certainly, I want to thank Kasi and all of those who were involved in making this forum possible. Um, I always start anytime that I'm involved with presenting anywhere by giving homage to God and to my family for making it possible for me to be in this space where I am. I acknowledge that a lot of work went into my being here on the part of family members, my grandparents, elders, and my parents. So it's a pleasure and a privilege, Kasi, that you would have this presentation at this time. Next screen, please. So when we look at race from a world perspective, we see that the white race comprises about 2/3 of the world's population, contrary to what most of us have been taught and have been told. And so I wanted to just give this pictorial representation of what we're really dealing with when we talk about race and racial issues relative to the world, because those of us who live in the United States often have, I think, a skewed view of really who the people are by way of racial representation throughout this world. In our second slide, Kasi, if you will, thank you, we get a visual representation of what our country here in the United States looks like. And I think that that helps us to put a context on what we're really looking at, because again, from our perspective as US citizens, often we think that the world looks like us, when from a racial perspective, the world is very different from us. And we see here that um, by 2045, that the white percentage of our population will actually be the racial minority. And they are presently a global minority. But when we draw from the works of Dr. Francis Cresswell Singh and Andrew Hacker, we see that when Europeans in the 15th century began to explore other parts of the world and they went to Africa, what they experienced when they saw people who were different from them by way of their culture, their languages, their ethnic groups, the way they practiced their religion was so much different from what they were used to as Europeans, that what they experienced, they saw as deficient. So that different became deficient. And a narrative was created around the deficiencies, so that the whole concept of race was socially constructed by Europeans as a means for stratification. Next slide, please. And when I think about that previous slide, I want you to consider that much of what we see in terms of people's behaviors now are a result of fear that the power dynamic in this country is going to change as people of color become the majority. And so that whole concept of race is a social construction that was created by white people, as I said, for the purpose of categorizing folks and stratifying folks. And we know it's a social construction because that depends on where you live geographically throughout this world, and how people categorize themselves racially often is dependent upon what privilege they choose to exhibit at any given particular time in their life. So here we look at critical race theory that says that all of the social institutions that have been created throughout the world, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, were created to support the white dominant narrative. And as I said, race is socially constructed. It permeates all aspects of social life, whether it's in our educational institutions or our banking institutions, our housing, our employment institutions, everywhere you go, race is a major factor in this country in terms of how people relate to each other and the social dynamics that play out between people. Race was typically determined by the dominant group, and in this country, white people are right now the dominant group, and so they use race to their advantage and set up these institutions to their advantage, which puts other people at a disadvantage. Black and Hispanic people and Native American people are disadvantaged in all spheres of life to the benefit of our white population. Next slide, please. So when we look at the history of the historical context, and I have here that the past is very much present. The things that have happened in our past are very much present in our future. They're represented in so many ways in the way that the dynamics play out in this country. So that in the 1700s, during the era of slavery, we had what were called slave patrols and night watchers. And these were typically white men who were sanctioned by the government to patrol the actions of slaves and to capture people, enslaved people who had run away, who had attempted to get out of this kind of bondage. What they did to these people when they were captured was so brutal in many ways. They would mutilate people, they would kill people, they would whip people almost to the point of death. They would castrate people, and that was done to create fear in the minds of the people who were slaves, so that they could maintain that whole system of slavery. Then in the 1800s, you had the era of vigilantism and lynch mobs, so that in between a 3-year period of time, there were about 3,000 people who were African American people who were lynched for various reasons. And one reason typically was that there was a break of the social norm for ways in which African American people were or were not to approach white people. And then we see in the late 19th century, the early formation of our police force, which emanated from the slave patrol era and the night watch era and the vigilante era. And so we see a progression of those practices that formed our early formal police departments, what we're seeing now. Then in the early 20th century, there was lynching was revisited, and that was really an intimidation and a fear tactic that was used by white people towards Black people and others, because Jewish people were lynched as well. But we're focusing on the African American community today. And I share a, um, a family history of this. I have, my family is from Alabama, Tuscaloosa, Alabama is where my grandparents originated from. And a cousin of mine who is well into his 70s shared with me while we were doing our family history and putting our family history together that he was about 8 years old when the sirens uh, came through. And I asked him, well, what were the sirens? And he said, oh, that was when the KKK was riding. And I thought that he meant riding on horseback, as we know that they did so often in their very beginnings. He said, no, riding at that period of time meant that they were coming through in a car procession through the neighborhoods, and they would ride from a such and such a street to such and such a street in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And they were preceded by the police, who would put their sirens on. And as the sirens were coming through the neighborhood, the Black homeowners would turn off their lights and lie down on the floor so that they couldn't be seen. And he shared with me how that was such a degradation of the humanness of people, that they would have to grown people, because he was just 8 years of age when my aunts and uncles with who he was visiting at that time turned off the lights and got down on the floor until that procession was over. And so he viewed that, he said, all of that was really a scare tactic and an intimidation tactic. So you have grown men and grown women who were at the mercy of the Klan. And the interesting thing about that was that they were preceded by the police. Those who were sworn to protect and serve them were the very people who were participating in this Klan parade, and who were also, in a way, protecting the Klan as they proceeded to march. So here you have, in 2020, next slide, please. In 2021, we have an epidemic level of white supremacists who have infiltrated law enforcement. And when I did my research on this, we're seeing that in 2006, the Federal Bureau of Investigation put out a document that showed that white supremacists have infiltrated law enforcement. They are part of the police departments. They are part of the FBI. They have gained positions. They have acquired jobs at these levels. And they showed further in 2019 that there were 178 instances of explicit racial bias by police that spanned 48 states. So we're seeing now that this is not something that is just sporadic, or something that just occurs here and there, but we have a widespread problem here in terms of white supremacist infiltration of our law enforcement agencies, and those people who are sworn to protect and to serve. In instances, as we're seeing, are the very people who are doing great harm to the Black community by way of killing and unarmed people. It's beautiful now that we have the technology through cell phones and through other capabilities, that when these instances occur that they can be video recorded and people can actually see in real time some of the things that are occurring in our community that the Black community has been uh, talking about for centuries. And so of these instances where the targets are racial minorities by police, 48% of the victims are Black individuals. And you know, we don't want to, it's such a hard topic to discuss in terms of race. We're not trying to say that all the policemen are bad. No, all police are not guilty of the horrific practices and the horrific things that are being experienced now. But they do operate in a context uh, of a in the context where they are sworn to serve, but um, they also hide sometimes out of fear from retribution, and they have that brotherhood within their department, within their law enforcement, so that they protect each other, even in instances where they know the practice is not fair and is unjust and is uh, it goes against police policy. Next slide, please. So when we talk about reform, there's a lot of talk about reform now as a result of the George Floyd killing and others that we've been seeing over the uh, past few years. And so some of the things that I thought about in terms of what can be done from a social work perspective in collaboration with police is that there should be internships the police have to take within communities of color. When I looked at some of the practices, I found very few instances where policemen have to go into communities of color prior to getting their degrees. And I think that it would be a better justice for communities of color for policemen to have to go in and to serve before they become quote unquote rookie cops. In some instances, we see where policemen go into the communities and they're not prepared to actually deal with the cultural context of communities. And sometimes they operate out of fear. There are there are people with, for instance, within communities where everyone knows certain individuals are not harmful. Maybe they have a mental health condition or they have a condition that causes them to act in inappropriate ways sometimes. The community residents um, are not concerned about those individuals, but when you have people who go into the community who haven't been socialized to those people, sometimes you have instances where great harm is done to those people. I'll give you an antidote real quick. In a community back home in Pittsburgh, where I'm from, there was a young man who had some mental health challenges, and newly minted policeman went into that community, didn't know that young person, but was confronted with that young person, and that young man ended up dead. And it may have been that if that police had more experience while he was in training with communities of color and with how to um, respond to people who have mental health issues, it may have been that that young man would not have lost his life. For our educators, a question that I have for us is, how do we teach respect for people's humanity? Because what we're seeing from these police shootings of unarmed people, I think, is that there's a general disrespect for the humanity of people. How can you shoot people in the back as they're running away from you unarmed? What can you say to that? That I think that says a lot about where a person is in terms of their respect for just the humanity of that individual. How can you do that? And then we're faced with the anti-racist curriculum. CSWE, the Council on Social Work Education, has called for all schools of social work to begin uh, incorporating anti-racist curriculum throughout all of their courses, to infuse that throughout all of the curriculum. Some schools we're seeing have started that. Our school at Kent School is starting, and we're having conversations about what our curriculum is going to look like in terms of preparing students to be able to work with people who are not, who do not look like them, who do not have the same cultural um, context and orientation that they have. Some people have called for abolishing some of the police departments that are just so steeped in racism, and that might be something that we as a society might need to look at. Well, you might say, well, that is pretty radical, but I would push back to say that when people are killed by people who are supposed to be serving them and protecting them, and those folks are not armed, those people in many instances aren't doing anything, that is radical. That it that is happening is very radical. So I'm going to suggest that we're going to have to do some radical things to correct what is happening in our society, and maybe starting over in some areas in certain police departments might be something that we need to do. So where is social work with this? Well, we have Jane Addams, we have Miss Lothrop in the very beginnings of our profession, who were working very hard for criminal justice and criminal justice reform. Social work has always been involved with police reform and with criminal justice reform. But it's just that in these earlier times, in these later times here, that we're really being pushed to look at how we can respond to what is happening throughout the nation in terms of these killings of people who are not harming anyone, who are unarmed, who in many instances are just being, and somehow they end up dead. So we have to continue as social workers to be involved. One of the things that I'm seeing is that although we're working in the criminal justice system as probation officers, as people who are doing the assessments, we're working in the prison systems as counselors, as a therapist. We need to do more in terms of leadership to get into those roles and positions where we can actually make policy and we can have an influence in on the kinds of laws that are being made. We're doing great jobs with advocacy, with working with the victims of violence, but I think we need to do much more in terms of our stepping up in those leadership positions at the national and state level, so that we can have an impact on the laws and on the policy that really make a difference in what is happening within our criminal justice system. And then last, I would like to say that there are many people in our higher education institutions who are working with criminal justice issues to reduce sentencing, of people, harsh sentencings of people. We have the Sentencing Project, which is a wonderful organization. It's been working for 30 years to uh, to address disparities in how people of race, of color, are unjustly and often unfairly given longer sentences than people in our white communities. And we have social workers who are working with that group, with that organization. So social work has always been involved in the criminal justice system. Uh, we worked in the uh, 50s and 60s and 70s in our civil rights movement and legislation uh, towards criminal justice issues. But I'd like for us to be more involved um, in leadership positions in terms of policy. And I think we can do more there. So that is what I have for you in a period of time that I was given. We have a national crisis that can't be overlooked. It's not going to be overlooked because we're now having people who are made aware. The country is now aware. The world is aware of the real issue and problem that we have with the criminal justice system in terms of our communities of color. And we're being called on to address this. And we have to, for the sake of our community, so that we don't lose any more people to police violence against particular communities of color. Thank you for this time that I've had to share.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Moore. You've given us so many things to think about, and also a great segue over to Derrick Jackson, who is going to start talking more about policy and some of this work. So, Derrick, please take it away.
Yeah, I was going to say thank you, Dr. Moore. Thank you, Kelsey, and everyone for hosting this. This is such an important conversation. And I just really do want to pick up where Dr. Moore left off. So I'm a social worker who became a police officer who now helps to run a police agency. And I know a lot of people kind of look sideways like how that happened. And so that's a story for another time. But what Dr. Moore ended off with is our role as social workers in law enforcement or the criminal justice system is much more than only being the person who responds out or only being the therapist or the probation officer, right? It really needs to think a little broader around how do we take the social work mentality, the way we view the world, and infuse it within law enforcement leadership. So I'll speak a little bit about that. So just getting back to how I got into law enforcement, I know how people see social work and law enforcement on opposite ends of the spectrum. And prior to me working and really getting to learn what was going on within the police world, I often thought about it that way as well. The complexity of the system, the laws, the policies, the protocols, the kinds of folks who come into law enforcement, all of the Supreme Court cases, you put all that together, the community interactions, the leadership, how we promote, how we hire, how we train, the culture of an agency. That's complex. And for any complex system you want to change, you really got to understand that complexity. So when I was on the outside of law enforcement, and I had all these ideas or aspirations of here's what law enforcement should do, here's how they can be better. The same things that I think now, however, how to implement those things, how to make those things happen on the outside looking in, I view them differently now. And I often say to people that, and maybe for some of you on this Zoom, this will be true, that I never thought about working in law enforcement. I didn't grow up in a community where we had a good relationship with police. In fact, I grew up in one of the more higher profile communities in Michigan where we had a disdain for law enforcement. And if someone would have asked me as I was a kid or even in college, if I would think about working in law enforcement, or even when the sheriff asked me to work here, my initial response to him was, no, you must be crazy. Because I always thought about us on opposite ends of the spectrum. When I was a young social worker working at a place called Ozone House with teens who were homeless, We had policies in place to keep officers away from our kids, right? Oftentimes our kids were street, they were in and out of the criminal justice system, and we specifically tried to keep them apart. All these years later, now when I look back, it was often a police officer who was actually bringing that young person to our doorstep. Or when you think about the woman who's just been beaten or abused, it is not uncommon for the police officer to be the first connection for that woman or for that family into the domestic violence shelter. Or the man who's homeless in the downtown area, it is not uncommon for that officer to be the referral source to the shelter. And I could go on and on and on. So back before I got into law enforcement, I didn't really think about that. I didn't think about law enforcement being the front door to many of the services that we in social work really care about. And so back in my ozone days, every night I would go home to get in my nice, comfortable bed. The kids that I was working with would leave our temporary shelter for the night, and our officers would be out on the street. During the day, we kept them separate. At night, when I was at home, guess what happened? Those young people and those officers were having interactions. And when I look back on it, as social workers, we could have been much more effective in helping our young people understand how to work with police, helping our police learn and know the young people that we so much cared about and how they could work together, so that when I went home at night and that officer and that young person interacted on the street, they had a much better outcome and a much better interaction. And to me, that was a kind of light bulb moment that I was missing when I was in direct service work that now I really see. So I know oftentimes people will say, well, what's social workers' role? Or the system is racist and corrupt, so why should we get involved? Or does it really conflict with your ethic, your moral dilemmas kinds of stuff, Derrick? And I guess I would just say this. Look at any jail or prison around the country and look at the root cause of why the folks who are in jail are there in the first place. Jails are full of people who have mental health diagnosis, who are homeless, who are suffering from SUD, substance use disorder, or lack of employment. Those issues or those populations that we in social work really care about are flooded within our criminal justice system. So our code of ethics actually implores us and calls us to be involved in the criminal justice world. Now, it doesn't say what clearly we need to do, right? I'm not saying you gotta have a gun and a taser and go to the police academy like me to get involved in criminal justice work. There are all kinds of levels to get involved. But if you care about the most vulnerable populations in our society, those vulnerable populations, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable populations, are already involved in the criminal justice system. And so for us to say we're not gonna get involved in it, even if we believe in abolition, I often say to some of my abolition buddies that like, look, okay, we can agree on that. However, that's not happening tomorrow and maybe not next week. So in the interim, what do we need to do to make sure the folks who are engaging with or are being interacting with the system are doing so to the best of their ability and have the most positive outcomes? The other piece related to that is when you think about this conversation around police brutality, specifically in social workers, I asked the question of like, what's our role as social work? And I use the analogy of the mom who may have neglected or abused their child. As a social worker, they get referred to us. Our ultimate goal is not to terminate the rights of that mom. We may know she did something wrong. Our ultimate goal is to work with that family and that mom to help build them back up and to bring that family unit back together. And I guess I would say the same thing for law enforcement and community. If we really do this right, who else but social work is better positioned to take a really horrible situation like the history that Dr. Moore has just laid out for us so beautifully, to take that history, take that community and bring people together. I often say that I really believe that law enforcement is an honorable profession. But again, as Dr. Moore has pointed out in history, law enforcement as a tool has been used to enforce racist policies since the beginning of our country. And so it isn't just a tool of law enforcement itself is just wrong or evil. It's how we choose to use it. And again, apart from me as a social worker who gets to be at the highest level of a law enforcement agency, is I get to think about and redesign and reimagine how our officers, our corrections officers, our volunteer staff, how we really get to engage with community. I do want to stress this point that I think we need to think broader around social work in the criminal justice system to be more than just a responder or someone who participates in a program. I know I said in the beginning, but I really do think we have to think about this social work theory, our ideals being the foundation of these larger systems, not just criminal justice, but healthcare systems and school systems, right? How we think about people, how we think about community, how we think about families and young people, having that be a core competency or piece of the system, I think is how you drive it to get better. If you are only marching in the streets, which is very important, if you are only advocating from the outside of the system, those who are in the system who don't want to see a change will simply build stronger walls and tougher doors to keep you out. So for some of you on this call, I think you might be the right fit to actually be inside of the system, to help change from within, to slowly open that door and then let all your friends come in to help you really change it from the inside out. In many cases, when I'm involved in conversations and there aren't law enforcement in the room, or it's just a community conversation, or it's only a law enforcement conversation without community, those efforts to me are doomed to fail. Because for any relationship or partnership, no matter who you are, if I extend my hand to you and you look me up and down and turn away, or if you extend your hand to me and I do the same and walk away, we don't have a relationship, right? It takes two people to extend that hand. And yes, there are lots of things that need to change. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that nothing's wrong. I wouldn't be doing the job that I do and the work that I do if I didn't believe fundamentally that things needed to change. And I'm going to share with you a few ways that we've been able to do that. But I just want to really stress that point, that it is about being the therapist. It is about being the community organizer. It is also about being the administrator within that law enforcement agency. It's also about being the worker in probation, as Dr. Moore has said. So it's about all those various different levels. I also want to mention a couple of key pieces that I've learned over time. And again, for someone on the call, this might resonate. I didn't think about it, but one of the first calls I ever went to just happened to be a 2-year-old that had drowned. And I won't bore you with the long story. It's a pretty traumatic story, and I'll never forget it. But the officer who was the first on scene to respond was the officer who pulled the young person from the swimming pool and gave mouth to mouth. And then fast forward, long story short, the story goes on, the young person dies. And I often ask, what happened to that officer after that situation? He went back, got a dry uniform, and maybe pulled one of you over a couple of hours later. And I give that because I think another component of this is, and Dr. Moore touched on it, the kinds of people that come into law enforcement and the stuff that they think about and how they think about the world. One thing we as social workers understand is when you are in the midst of micro traumas on a regular basis and you aren't dealing with those things appropriately, it starts to have you think about the world a certain way. If I only see the worst in society, that's the way I view the world. That's the lens that I view. So even for some of our young officers that come into the profession and they have all the right mindset to do a great job, over the years, if you, like any of us, were dealing with trauma inappropriately, natural human reaction is to put these brick walls around ourselves and to not then open up to be able to deal with community in the ways that we really want to. One of the last analogies I'll give you is for any complex system or any big building, say you want to demolish or you want to demolish that skyscraper that was built. It takes just as many architects to demolish it as it did to build it in the first place. So you can't just run into that building, throw your dynamite around and hit detonate, right? You need to literally understand the weaknesses and the strengths of that structure. You need to build alternative structures to move your stuff into before you ever place your first stick of dynamite. And so even for those on the call who are like, blow up the system, let's start all over. Got it. Okay, let's do that. But how you do it, being very intentional about that. We didn't get here yesterday, as Dr. Moore talked about the long history of this country in policing. And these quick, rash, yep, let's just do this, isn't necessarily gonna get us out of this for tomorrow. And so to really think and be intentional, because the last thing we wanna do is to make decisions today because we really intended for it to have a positive impact, but it really winds up harming the people on the back end that we really say we wanna help the most. So just a couple of things for us to think about. I will share with you that a couple of quick concepts of what we've been able to do. How you hire someone, the kinds of competencies you look for in officers in our agency is different. In our agency, the kinds of competencies we look for in a police officer are some of the same exact competencies that would make a good social worker. And people would say, well, how do you do that? Well, you have a social worker as a part of that discussion. You talk about what we value. You ask the community what they value. You put those in your hiring process and you look for those officers who really exemplify that. I'll give you one small example. It may seem simplistic, but to me, it resonates. In our jail, one of the last steps to get hired is you sit down with the commander and you do this commander's review. And the commander will ask you a few questions. How was your tour? What did you see? What did you like? And if you come into our office after your tour and you say, oh, you know what? Central command and all those locking mechanisms, and you do this, and you got these doors, and you got these cameras, that lets us know what you're thinking about is how you hold people. Mm-hmm. If you, however, come into that conversation and you say, wait, I didn't realize you had like one female officer to 20 male inmates, and you offer this programming, and they get to do this, and you start talking about the needs of the individual, that lets me know you're thinking about people and root causes versus just incarcerating people. One small example of a different way of thinking about how you hire people. It's also how you promote. Law enforcement is a hierarchical organization, right? People want to get promoted up to be supervisors, sergeants, lieutenants, directors, and the sheriff. And if I am promoting people who don't have the values that I think most of us on this call really represent, I am sending a message to our staff that that is what we're looking for. However, if I promote people from within who believe fundamentally and then behave in a way on the street the way that we would want them to, that also sends a message to the young upstart who wants to get promoted. I need to do these things in order to get promoted. It also then means that that sergeant or that supervisor is now helping to educate those young officers, helping to quality assure, reprimand, overwatch, all those things to help ensure that our agency continues down the path that we ultimately want them to go. So I often hear people talk about training. Yes, it's about training. But if I just train you, you check the box and you go off and your behavior doesn't change, what does the training really do? So it's about training, it's about policy, it's about oversight, and it's about behavioral change and that cultural shift. And so being a part of an agency that can not only develop programs to help divert young people from ever getting into the system, absolutely. However, how do we change the system from within to make sure when someone does touch the system, that we aren't just about crime fighters, we are problem solvers. We're not just about incarcerating and locking someone up, but we're about when someone leaves our jail, they are better than when they came in the first place. Those small semantic differences for us, I think really then go to our mission and our values. I don't want to make it sound like everything we do is perfect. It is not. I would have retired or left if we were doing everything right. It is not the case. But I do want to challenge us to shift our paradigm. Mm-hmm. That when you see the badge, even for someone like me who grew up in a community that had a really bad interaction, that you can reimagine what law enforcement is. That it doesn't have to be law enforcement. It could be police services. We provide a service. Arresting someone is not the only thing we do. We also hire, and we have, it's one of my favorite programs to talk about, a street outreach team where we hire people who have been in our jail or in our prison, not to sweep our floors or be informants. They are literally the experts on the communities that we interact with the most. And we pay them like professionals to work in our community. So we hire more felons in the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office than any other department in Washtenaw County government, and probably than most places that hire in the entire county. Why? Not because they're just felons who've committed crimes, right? But we fundamentally believe that they have an expertise, that they can really help bridge that gap, and we put our money where our mouth is. I came in as a civilian staff. I did go to the police academy, and I sit at the highest level of the organization, not because it sounds good or it boosts my ego, but because the sheriff said, if you really want to make this change, you can't just have one or two deputies and do one or two small programs. You need to have a philosophical, fundamental, foundational shift. And so I just, I'll end there because I really want us to get to questions, but I really want to challenge us to think about our paradigm in social work. You as a social worker can not only just go out and get hired in a law enforcement agency. We in social work education need best to prepare our social work students to be effective when they do that. Otherwise, they will put us in a position as a social worker. If we don't have the skills and the ability to really engage, if we fail, they will use it as a reason to shut the door and not let us back in. And finally, I will just share with you a story that just happened 2 days ago, and it went on for 36 hours. Young man suffering from mental illness, 32 years old, lives with his parents, assaults his parents, pulls out an AR-15 and starts shooting. They run, they leave, they call us. We are in a situation with a barricaded gunman where he's shooting at police officers for 36 hours. Refuses to come out. He's on social media, on Facebook Live. He's chatting with me on our Facebook page, but he will not come out. When the sheriff was asked after he peacefully came out why he thinks we were successful in getting this person out without anyone getting harmed, he said 2 reasons. The social workers that are embedded within our SWAT team and our crisis negotiation team, and because of patience. In some agencies around the country, you may see the SWAT team run in, and the only thing that could have happened in that situation is if we would have run in, he would have shot us, we would have shot him, or everybody would have been shot at once. Nothing good would have come of that. It did take 36 hours of painstaking work, but in the end, everyone went home and he is getting the help that he needs. I say again, that only happens with us embedded and engaged with law enforcement. So for those who may challenge what's our real role, 36 hours ago, that saved someone's life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jackson. That was great information. And to kind of pull things to a close for today is going to be Doug Smith, and then we'll have a few minutes for some question and answers. So Doug, some Texas perspective on all of this.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the invitation. And I know that I already see questions coming up. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to give some perspective really around some of the work that we're doing. And I'm going to make sure that we have that time for questions at the end. But I wanted to kind of view this from the standpoint of drug policy enforcement. So this is one of our areas of specialty and research and advocacy. And it's really helpful to look at it from that perspective because it gives you a glimpse about how policing and race how drug policy actually intersects with policing and race in really detrimental ways. So, and I think it's really important because yesterday was the day that George Floyd Act was heard on the in the House, and just literally hundreds of people showed up for the rally and for testimony, and so much of this really does relate. In fact, how drug enforcement really gives rise to police saturation, pretextual stops, how it targets communities of color. And so I'm going to share some slides here. All right. So I will tell you that in 2017, Travis County was looking to open up a new jail facility, right? They needed to build a new wing of the jail. And so this was strange to us because index crimes in Travis County had gone down about 22%. It was just sort of a real mystery because they actually wanted to expand beds. They weren't saying that, but they did. They wanted to take it up to 400 beds for a female wing. And so when we dug in, we found out that despite the decline in index crimes, drug possession arrests had skyrocketed. In fact, they had skyrocketed by about 43%, and the number of new cases by 66%. And so that's 2.5 times higher than the rate of increase throughout Texas. So we really had to dig in. And so our starting point with that was we wanted to find out, okay, so what's giving rise to all of these drug offenses that's causing us to have to build a new jail? And what are the circumstances so that we could do targeted diversion, and where were people located? So always our framework was, how do we divert? That is to say, if we, hopefully on the front end at the police level, and actually get them into some type of services so that people never go into jail. Because that, from our standpoint at that time, seemed like a bold alternative to actually trying to divert someone who's already been arrested. So what we found as we were digging in was, it was exactly what we would have expected to see, that possession of controlled substance cases were 29.4% Black. So that's the Black population in Travis County is a little bit more than 8%. So it was a rate of disparity nearly 4 times. And when we also dug in, what we found was we coded every single one of the arrests that we read. So we read 3,000 arrest affidavits, and we created a coding system for the circumstances that give rise to the arrest. And what we found was that the reasons you think a drug arrest might occur aren't what you think, right? It's not someone suspected of dealing. It's not someone open purchase. It's not someone with drug-induced behavior. And some of those are some of the codes, and I can happy to talk to anyone offline about what those codes mean. By and large, drug arrests arise out of a traffic stop. And so how it plays out, and it was almost textbook, you could predict it every single time. Officer following an individual, wait for the individual not to signal, or look for whether the individual has registration or something like that. It's a pretextual stop. They pull the person over, and the reason that they would always say was, I smell marijuana, in order to get in the car and search for the drugs, and they'd find it. So what we also saw was how these drug offenses were concentrated. And so the broader story that we were seeing was a story of gentrification. So we were seeing where the drug offenses were happening in a very, very high, the drug arrests were happening in a highly concentrated way within select areas of town. Those same areas happen to be areas that were really desirable for new development. So one of the areas was East Riverside, and we can see right now the East Riverside, they have a whole master plan, and it's pushing all the way out towards Ben White. And so it was really no mystery to us. These were also communities where there was just heavy concentration of police, and this has a huge impact on social vulnerability. So we took the arrests and location and then overlaid with social vulnerabilities. And so you'll see on the highest quartile, those are the areas where there was the highest concentration of arrests, that they had the lowest, the people in those communities had the lowest level of college education, highest highest uninsured rate, lowest number of jobs, highest number of people 16 to 19 out of the workforce, highest rates of poverty, highest social vulnerability. If you look at the housing issues, and this is particularly important in a place like Austin, because because high police saturation usually precedes gentrification or new development. And so what we saw was highest eviction rate, lowest median housing value, highest number of apartments built, and highest number of households renting, usually paying about half of their income in rent or more. So why is this important? So when you do high police concentration in these communities, what happens is that police are usually there to address higher rates of violence, but violence is usually concentrated at about 2% of that population, right? It's the same population that might engage in violence is also the same population most likely to experience violence. And so by having high concentration, what that gives rise to is what's called proactive policing. So we did some ride-alongs with the with the police in these neighborhoods. And here's what we saw. We saw police running plates all shift long. Running plates. What that meant was they were sitting at their console running license plates, and they would decide whether or not to stop someone, to give them a fine for not having health insurance. But again, these are communities that had the highest social vulnerability, so therefore they're the least likely to be able to afford liability insurance and so on. So high police concentration goes way beyond drug arrests. It actually impacts people economically. What we also found was that as people were coming into the criminal justice system, despite a commitment to diversion, what was normally happening was from these communities, when people were arrested, they were less likely to make bond, more likely to sit it out in jail, more likely to take a plea deal for jail time, less likely to get into probation, drug court. And what happens is then with that felony, you're returned back to the community, not able to find a job. Now you got a felony. Now you can't even rent in your own name. We have a whole effort going on at the Capitol right now just to get a clean slate law so people who are at least eligible to have your record sealed can get it done automatically. But so we see that efforts on every level to address higher rates of violence, higher rates of drug offense actually led to saturation and worse social vulnerability or gentrification. So one of the decisions that we had to make as an organization as we saw this was that our starting point was diversion. That was our starting point. What we realized is that this is an issue of targeting in communities of color, not paying attention to the underlying needs and not paying attention to how efforts like community policing aren't interpreted the same way. I will tell you, I live in Buda in Hayes County. Most of the Austin police officers live near me, right? This formerly incarcerated person, they're like my neighbors, right? They don't live in these communities. In fact, we did ride-alongs with them, and I will tell you some of the things we heard. We heard with police officers saying, they hate us here. They feel like we're an occupying force. We heard police officers, we went with one police officer who said, well, I'm here to hunt criminals. And during the shift, took us around to the trunk in order to show off his hunting rifle in the trunk of his car, right? So community policing, how we describe it, is not how many police forces describe it. So, we've got a lot of work to do. I will say that, how I've contributed to that was starting point being diversion. Our starting point has to be somewhere else. We have to realize that this is about race, it's about social vulnerability, and we've got to treat it that way before we jump into interventions in communities most impacted. I try to do that fast in order to leave time for questions.
Thank you so much for your presentations. They were powerful. Thank you so much. We do have some questions in the Q&A, and I want to share them with you. Our first question came in early on with the comment, Camden, New Jersey dismantled their police force back in 2013, and then they remade it focusing on community policing with emphasis on de-escalation and seeing force as a last resort. Is there a way this could happen across the US? What policies could help start this process or make it easier?
So I'll chime in on that one. A great question. I guess I would say that, each community is unique. That's the other thing about policing in the United States. You have so many local police agencies. In some of our larger cities, right, you may have one large jurisdiction, but like in Washtenaw County, we have 14 different police agencies. And so some of this, I think, is really going to be dependent on the agency and the community. So there isn't a one size fits all. partly why I think, and I don't know the whole story about Camden, but someone else, another question was around unions. I think partly why some police agencies get abolished and then reincorporated. People acknowledge that they need some form of policing. However, the current agency, not the profession itself, the current agency is in such a maybe disarray that they feel like there's no way to reform, right? Like it has to go away and start over. And so going back to the whole thing around how you hire, how you train, I'm sure in Camden, when they started to rehire officers, they looked at a different kind of officer than they were hiring before. They still had police and they still did some of the same stuff, but how they did it, I think was a pretty major piece. So can this happen nationwide? Again, I think that really just depends on the particular community. So yes, all around the country, places are having these kinds of conversations. I'll throw something out there though. Community policing at its core is around understanding your community. Got it, great. There are other things out there. Problem-oriented policing is the philosophy that we operate under, which is understanding the root cause of problems and being problem solvers, not just crime fighters. And so from a philosophical perspective, they may sound similar, but just because I know the community doesn't necessarily by itself intrinsically mean I'm going to treat people differently. It's my fundamental beliefs and values that drive my behavior. And I think that's the key piece we're trying to get down to, is those fundamental beliefs and behaviors. One last tidbit, go look at your local police agency's training budget. You'll see what they value, right? If I'm only training you to shoot, to fight, and to drive fast, like those things that are necessary for law enforcement to use, but not the things that they use every single day, and I'm not training you in all those other kinds of procedural justice, cultural competency, I am telling you as a staff member, this is what I value and these are the tools you should use. So when you get into a situation, I haven't trained you with those other tools, so you're naturally going to use the tools I trained you in, which is force. So when you think about abolishing or starting over, even for a new agency like Camden, those are the kinds of things we need to really focus on as social workers and raise questions about.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. And we did have a second presentation, or a second question that was directed at you, and you responded, but I'd like to share the question and let you share with the group. The question was worded like this: Mr. Jackson, since you're now on the inside, how do you view, or what is your perception of scholar Audre Lorde's infamous quote, "For the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house"? The rest of that quote is, they may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change.
So I did answer the chat. I love that quote, and it is, and I said in my answer, ever present, I think, in my mind in this work for a number of different reasons. And the way I responded is, I agree with that 100%. However, what if we take ownership of the house? What if now, as the owner, you start to redesign the house? You start to change the foundation of the house. You start to knock out walls, take off pieces and demolish pieces that never should have been there, and then build stuff that should be there currently. So I don't disagree with it. I think it's also a long path forward. And so maybe in the end, you wind up tearing the house down. However, until we get to the point where we can tear the house down, we have to kind of redesign some things. So I think both things can be true at the exact same time, which does go back to this whole social work ethical dilemma that some people may have around, can we work within a system like law enforcement? And that's something that I often think about, and with all my interns and students, we talk about. However, the last piece I think I wrote in that answer was the alternative of doing nothing, to me, just like what if we did nothing? Like that's the alternative, is to do nothing. And social workers to kind of stand on the sideline or only be on the outside. And to me, that just doesn't feel like something I can do. It may seem harder to make change in this way, but if it's long-term, systemic, real change we want, I think it takes that hard level work of both inside and outside the agency. I do want to stress that too. I'm not saying that everyone needs to work in an agency. Some of my best friends who are marching in the street, and if you know anything about Washtenaw, they were marching against Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office, the agency that I worked for over the summer. We had a pretty major case here right after George Floyd, like 2 days after, not to that level, but that marching makes my job easier. I tell them that all the time. So it doesn't feel comfortable, doesn't make my job any less difficult as far as like the relationships and talking to people, but it does allow for the system to be pushed in a certain direction because that system has to stand at attention and pay attention to what the community is saying. Law enforcement should reflect the community's values. We get our legitimacy from the community. I think in many cases, we've kind of lost that, but really our legitimacy comes from the community. So the community can dictate the kind of policing that they want to see.
Dr. Moore or Mr. Smith, would either of you like to respond to that question as well?
I think Derrick did an excellent job with that. We've got 400 years of deeply entrenched systematic racism in our criminal justice system, as well as throughout the whole of society. And so I think that the change will be incremental. It's not going to happen overnight. There's going to be a lot of pushback from within because people have their own vested interests for why things should stay the way they are, for why the status quo should remain. But I think social work is in a very good position now within this period of time, because people have rallied, the world is looking, people were tired, folks want change. And so I think it's a good time for us to be positioned to help to work with police departments, with the criminal justice system to make these kinds of changes. I don't want us to get discouraged when it doesn't happen, as Derrick said, overnight, because I don't think that's going to happen. But it will happen if we don't get tired. My concern, and maybe Derrick and Doug can speak to this, is that we have all of this effort rallying around anti-racism. And I hope that over time, over a period of a few years, just doesn't peter out, and then we go back to business as usual. Can I get maybe, Derrick, your response to that?
I worry about that every day, because when an incident happens around the country and people see it on their social media feed or on the news channel, they really get motivated and they come to the table. And quickly, it seems like that motivation subsides and people going back to just clicking, or as I call them, being Facebook advocates versus really putting in the time and the effort and the work. I mentioned I've been doing this work for 13 years. And I'll tell you, it really is not easy. It is not to be the one of only sometimes, particularly in the beginning. But you're right, Dr. Moore. I think having that, it's not about winning the race. Like, the race never ends. It's like a continual improvement piece, like that long journey, I think is a really, really important concept for us to have. And in particular for social workers, again, that's our role. How do we continue to motivate the community and continue to bring people back together, even after you may feel like you've taken a step forward and then 5 steps backward? The work can't end, right? Because people's lives are at stake. So this is something that we cannot kind of just say, all right, I'm moving on to the next thing.
You mind if I jump in? I know that there are other questions, but I just think that this is really important. Yesterday there was the George Floyd Act, which is creating more transparency, limiting some of the powers of both the police union and us and police officers. At the same time, there was a counter hearing that was driven by police to make it so counties can't reduce police funding, right, without losing their own funding, right? So there's this massive counter movement. Nothing has so much galvanized the white voting base on the Republican side than this defund movement, right? So I am not so helpful that incremental change is happening. I think we're looking at a breaking point. Mass incarceration, there were ways of controlling Black and brown lives prior to 1976. After 1976 and post-Voting Rights Act, there was a whole consolidation of power, and that was, and one of the ways that they drove that was war on drugs, and 3 strikes, you're out. Just everything that drove mass incarceration. It happened suddenly. It wasn't any sort of gradual. It happened suddenly, and it was a political force right now, right? So what we see now is a clash of politics, clash of interest groups right now. And so I am not so hopeful about incremental change. What I think is going to happen is a breaking point. But I will tell you right now, I have worked 4 sessions at the Capitol on mass incarceration, and I have never seen this much fierce opposition to reform, towards accountability, right? And we stand a real likelihood of moving backwards. So I hate to leave you with that, but it is so important for us to understand this moment, this cultural and political moment that we're in.
I just want to say kudos. Yes, I just want to co-sign that. He is absolutely right. And the ability, as my puppy jumps up, I think that tipping point of potentially moving back, and the only piece I'll just add to it is, I think we have to be smart around how we talk about these issues. And prior to some of the defund stuff, it really was a bipartisan issue around corrections and things starting to shift, right? Like reentry work. I'm talking to just as many Republicans who want to fund the stuff that we're doing around reentry and jail work, just because of economics, it doesn't make sense. Defund movement, and I'm not saying we don't push for defund, that's not my point. What I'm saying is something has shifted, and I haven't thought long enough to know what has shifted, but Doug, I just want to co-sign that you're right. Something has shifted in the political narrative to where there is really big political pushback on that particular piece of it. I also just say this. There are studies out there, and I ask my neighbors where I live at, primarily African-American, lower income neighborhood where I've been for, over 20 years. Certain communities, like where I grew up in a violent neighborhood, we're not talking about defunding the police. Let's just be clear, right? We're talking about how people get treated.
Mm-hmm.
And defund becomes maybe the language that people use to change policing. But also that, I just want to be clear with that. If you are going into a community saying this is what we need to do for them, be careful with that, because your intentions may be good, but your impact may be something different.
Derrick, I will piggyback off of that. In terms of the African-American community, people have such pushback against us for wanting to step up and for wanting these things to change. No one is saying that we want to be in control and that we want to have the power and that we want to be the top. Nobody in the Black community is saying that. All we're saying is that we want an equal opportunity to advance and to do our thing. Take your foot off of our neck, take your knee off of our neck, give us an opportunity to live, to have good quality of life, to make contribution to society. But no one in the African American community, the Black community, is saying we want to be on top, we want to be the most powerful. And I think that's where a lot of the pushback comes from, because people simply don't, people in control and people who are making the decisions don't want to do that. They don't want to share that.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. And with that, we have come up on the top of our hour and a half. I would like to invite Kasi to share some closing words, and thanks to you all.
Thank you, Liz. I just really want to thank our panelists, Dr. Moore, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Smith, for such an engaging and powerful conversation today. You've given us so much to think about, and have also really modeled the different roles that social workers can have in these efforts to influence change. So we greatly appreciate that, and thank you for your time. Thank all of you attendees who were able to join us for today. This has been recorded, and I know that we'll get the information out to you on the recording as soon as that's available. And we look forward to seeing you at the Jack Otis lecture next year. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.